Well, let's start with just the basics. We're just hours into the US-Israeli joint military operation called Operation Epic Fury. What do we know so far? What happened overnight?
Well, we know that the diplomatic maneuvers of the last couple of weeks were maskirovka, not likely to produce a real diplomatic compromise. I've been clear about this for some time because it was obvious that the Iranians were not prepared to yield on the key demands that were being made by President Trump's negotiators, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, not forgetting Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who's also been involved. And what they had said was, you need to give up enriching uranium and hand over your weapons grade uranium. You need to end your ballistic missiles program. And thirdly, and least importantly, stop financing the terrorist proxies. That's less important because those proxies are so much weaker than they were at the time of October 7th, 2023. And the Iranians essentially said no. And although we were told by the Omani foreign minister and others that these negotiations were going somewhere, they weren't. And when they ended in Geneva on Thursday and the Americans left, they were not intending to return. What's happened, and of course, we're now in the fog of war, so I have to speak with the caution of somebody who's observing this from outside the government. But what we know is that the United States and Israel have struck multiple targets in Iran, aiming at regime personnel as well as regime infrastructure. And the early reports, including from Israeli sources, suggest that at least some influential figures in the Islamic Republic have been hit. Of course, a rumor is going around they've got the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. That is not confirmed, but that tells us what the goal of Operation Epic Fury and the Israeli counterpart, Roaring Lion, is to decapitate the Islamic Republic. And as you mentioned in your introduction, to hope that out of that decapitation can come a revolution in Iran, a new regime, but not a regime imposed by the United States and Israel, a regime that the US and Israel hope that Iranians will create for themselves in the conditions that have been created or are being created by these strikes.
And just to make sure the listener is following along, you're saying that they've targeted both private residences of high-ranking regime officials and political leaders, as well as military assets. Is that right?
That is my understanding, but I emphasize it's an ongoing operation at a relatively early stage, and all kinds of rumors are flying around. I actually think more important than that is the way the Iranian regime has responded, because it's responded by retaliating against US targets in multiple Gulf states. I think 6 different Gulf states have been on the receiving end of Iranian missiles, or perhaps in some cases drones. It's again not entirely clear. That's remarkable in 2 respects. First of all, not much damage seems to have been done. Again, fog of war, but that's my understanding, because most of these missiles have in fact been intercepted and destroyed, did not hit their targets. Secondly, the Iranians are doing their level best to lose friends and alienate people by carrying out these attacks. Most of the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, for example, certainly Kuwait, Qatar, do not want to be combatants, don't want to be involved in this conflict, and have done their best to emphasize their neutrality. Well, that's out the window. And it's pretty clear, for example, from the statement from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, that the Gulf Arabs are pretty disgusted to find themselves under attack from Tehran. So whatever else is happening, we can see a certain desperation in the Iranian regime's response, I think.
And what are they targeting in these regional countries? US military bases? I know there's fear that oil fields will be struck. What right now do we know are they targeting?
Well, we certainly know that they were trying to get the US naval base in Bahrain.
Mhm.
That must have been something that the US anticipated, and I'd be surprised if significant damage was inflicted there. I haven't yet heard any reports of attacks on oil infrastructure, but it would be surprising if the Iranians didn't try to do that. Their kind of most impactful response, the thing that would cause the most damage to the United States, would be if they could somehow block the Strait of Hormuz and entirely disrupt the huge flow of oil that goes through that strait. That would cause a big price spike in the oil market when trading gets going tomorrow. But we don't yet have any reports to suggest that that's been attempted, much less succeeded.
I want to link this to a question that's coming from the audience right now, which is people look at this conflict, they see it as hundreds of miles away. They worry about increase in oil prices as a result. And someone asks, please help me explain to my 30-year-old son who works hard but cannot afford to buy even a small home why the US's leadership in overthrowing the Iranian government is putting America first. Why is this in America's interest?
Well, President Trump spelt out in his address last night that this is, in some measure, a preemptive act to stop Iran acquiring nuclear weapons, as well as a battery of missiles that can deliver them, not only deliver them locally in the Middle East, but potentially further afield, potentially against European targets, as former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett pointed out in an interview earlier today. I don't think anybody could claim the Iranians were about to strike heartland America, but President Trump and others have pointed out that Iran has been waging war against Americans. This regime has been waging war against Americans well since 1979. And after half a century of being one of the worst actors in the world, President Trump has called time on it. I think it's worth saying to any 30-year-old son, or indeed to teenage sons and daughters, if you have them, that Iran has been one of the world's principal sponsors of terrorism over this half century, and many lives have been lost in every decade since then. American lives. The Iranians were responsible for many of the deaths, for example, in Iraq, and certainly Iran was the principal sponsor of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad when they carried out the October 7th, 2023 attacks. So part of the answer to the question is that this regime was in the last chance saloon. And when they slaughtered nearly 40,000 of their own people in early January, crushing popular protests, I think the Iranian leadership lost what little shreds of legitimacy they had left. But there's another point which I think is not so explicitly emphasized by the president. That is that the United States is sending a global signal. It sent it to the Venezuelans, it's sending it to the Iranians. But I think the real recipients are in Moscow and Beijing. And the message is, do not mess with the United States. The United States has overwhelming military superiority. It has full spectrum dominance, and it will come for you if you cross its red lines. And I think Americans need to recognize the extent to which the United States lost that credibility, particularly under Presidents Obama and Biden, and getting it back, getting America's reputation back for being a superpower you don't mess with, that can save many American lives in the future.
People wonder how an air campaign without American boots on the ground practically leads to regime change. And I want to put that question to you. Is the idea that these strikes destabilize the government and empower the people to overthrow? How do you see it playing out?
That is certainly the theory. The president drew a very clear distinction, although it was implicit. In 2003, in Operation Iraqi Freedom, the United States tried to give freedom, force it, you might say, on the Iraqi people by not only deposing Saddam Hussein, but then trying to run Iraq and trying directly to institute a democracy there. I think we would all agree that the outcome was not ideal. And although I think Iraq today is much less of a threat than the Iraq of Saddam Hussein, it still was a very expensive undertaking, and it cost American lives and also left many American soldiers badly injured and incapacitated. So this is not what we're doing here. What we're doing here is using air power in particular to give the Iranian people a chance to take their own freedom, to seize their own freedom by overthrowing the theocratic regime that has ruled over them since 1979. Is it certain to work? No, nobody can say with certainty that a people who just saw tens of thousands of presumably their bravest young people mown down in the streets of Tehran and other cities are going to try it again. It's possible you could get civil war. It's possible you could get complete chaos. There is clearly that risk. But I will say something that I don't think is said often enough. People say this has never succeeded. It's never been attempted, really, to try to change a regime with air power. Well, that's certainly true because we've never had the kind of precision in air power that we now have. The most impressive thing about not only what we're seeing today, but what we saw last year when Israel and the United States struck Iran is the incredible accuracy with which Israel and the United States can use air power to take out the people who run this evil, murderous regime. So it was never possible to do that. You couldn't do that to, say, Berlin in 1944. And I think this is something that needs to be emphasized. There are technological possibilities for exercising American power today that didn't previously exist because of huge advances in the targeting of missiles as well as drones. And that's why this has a better chance of working than many people realize. At some point, this regime just runs out of capacity to continue its repressive system. And President Trump is taking a gamble, no question, taking a gamble that he can tip over the Islamic Republic and have it changed to something else. In this case, we're not specifying what that something else is, whereas we tried to do that in Iraq after 2003 and didn't really succeed.
You've written about how great power conflicts have the power to escalate beyond the original plan. We're talking about this a little bit in the context of a potential power vacuum, balkanization amongst the ethnic groups within Iran, total chaos, and what comes next. What do you think is the biggest risk right now in the next coming days and weeks?
Well, a lot of people who are commenting on this, as I am, in the fog of war, are worrying about regional complications. I'll give you an example. Yoav Gallant, the former Israeli defense minister, has written an excellent essay arguing that Turkey is going to take advantage of the vacuum of power created by Iran's collapse. And Turkey, he argues, is no longer a reliable ally of the West or friend of Israel. So that's the kind of thing that I think experts in Middle Eastern politics are going to be talking about. My own concern is global rather than regional. The way I would put it is that the United States, though it is the dominant military power in the world, can only do so many things at one time. And it has three major claims on its attention beyond the Western Hemisphere, where some elements in President Trump's administration want to focus. Outside the Western Hemisphere, beyond the Americas, there is Europe, where a war is raging in Ukraine, the outcome of which we do not know, and the end of which is not yet in sight. There's the Middle East itself, which is what we're here to talk about, but there's also the Far East. And we have to bear in mind that as the United States confronts a kind of axis of authoritarians of China, Russia, Iran, not forgetting North Korea, by far the most powerful is China. Economically and technologically. And while we are dealing with first Venezuela and then Iran, and potentially also trying to bring about peace in Ukraine, China is preparing to make some kind of move against Taiwan. And that is the biggest danger that I see, that our attention once again is focused on the Middle East, as it has been so often in our lifetimes. And that is going to create an opportunity, perhaps not this year, but perhaps next year, for Xi Jinping to make a move against Taiwan that would be enormously consequential for the global balance of power.
Do you see us looped into a conflict that far into the distance that it would impact Xi's thinking in terms of invading Taiwan?
I think there's no question that this is the risk that weighs on the mind of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane. Indeed, we know that one of his complaints about the administration's recent strategic focus on the Western Hemisphere was that it was understating the threat posed by China. And he's right about that, because China is the one real rival that the United States needs to fear, because China now has built a navy that, at least in terms of number of vessels, is as big as the US Navy, arguably bigger. China has the capabilities in its vast array of missiles to sink our aircraft carriers, to take out satellite communications, to take out, say, bases in Guam, for example, with hypersonic missiles. China is a far, far bigger threat to the United States than Iran or Russia, much less Venezuela. And so I think we've got to keep in mind that the United States is playing a global geopolitical game. I call it the three-body problem, where there are sort of three parts of the world that draw the United States in. There's Europe, there's the Middle East, and then there's the Far East, East Asia. And this has been true now for more than a century. And it's very, very hard to play successfully in all three of these theaters at the same time. In fact, it would be impossible, and everybody knows this, for the United States to cope simultaneously with crises in Europe, the Middle East, and the Far East. And remember, it's only a few years ago, when he was running the Central Intelligence Agency, that Bill Burns said that Xi Jinping had told China's military leaders to be ready for war in 2027. Reminder, that's next year.
Well, Niall, thank you so much for joining us and bringing so much sense making on a unfolding situation and potentially a budding war. You can read his analysis in the Free Press later today. Thank you for being here.
Been my pleasure.